glad to see the POWs. And I'm glad y'all are here, and I bet you're glad you're here. But thank you all very much for coming. You know, our exposure, or mine anyway, to POW started was because of Hollywood. We saw Steve McQueen take that motorcycle over that fence in Germany, and we saw the British soldiers build the bridge over the River Kwai. And of course, there's Rambo going back into the jungles of Vietnam and trying to rescue a forgotten POW. But it's unfortunately they all couldn't have a Colonel Flink like Hogan's Heroes. That wasn't such a bad duty station, I guess, if you had to be a POW. But in the history of humankind, warring enemies have often had an issue about POWs. Do you just wait and kill everybody, or do you take prisoners? Well, if you took prisoners, you had to feed them. Well, that presented a problem a lot, but sometimes if you captured them, then you could use them as slaves. Make them do the work that you didn't want to do, kind of have them contribute to society. But that was one of the governing rules in this bitter right of victory. Depending on the time, the place, the circumstances, and maybe a tyrant's whim, a person caught in wartime might be identified by many different names. Which captives are POWs? Most were kept as slaves, but back in about 1800 BC, the sixth king of Babylon set up a list of rules. He had 242 of them, but one of them spoke about POWs, how they should be treated, how they should be swapped back into society where they came from. Years later, the Emperor of China used POWs to build the Great Wall of China. While he had them, he thought, well, I'm going to have him build me a great tomb. And he did, big enough to house not only himself, but 800 terracotta soldiers. And in ancient Rome, Caesar, in his battles, captures and sells 33,000 Belgians into slavery. And of course, there's William the Conqueror, who built the Tower of London to put POWs in. Years later, the Aztec warriors sacrificed 3,000 POWs in what is now Mexico City. But in the United States, or in America, in 1618, POWs arrived. They come across in ships from West Africa. They're sent to Virginia, and they become slaves. During the American Revolution, 1775, there were 11,000 American colony POWs that died on a British prison ship, the Jersey, in New York Harbor. During the War of 1812, off the coast of Maryland, a gentleman by the name of Francis Scott Key writes a poem in defense of Fort McHenry. This poem was later put into music and is now what we refer to as our national anthem. In Civil War, POWs were sometimes made hostages and were treated back and forth with opposing sides for give you a colonel for 2 majors or whatever. But sometimes there wasn't enough on one side to swap with the other, so the side would go into town and arrest a couple of civilians. So we'll add these 2 civilians in the pot to make the trade. Early on in the Civil War, soldiers that were captured were released to return home, as long as they promised not to get back in the fight. Now, this is called parole. Well, in case the soldier could come back, if he was part of one of these prisoner swaps, and once that was done, and he was swapped in exchange, he was then pardoned. Then he could go back and fight. So there were several soldiers on both sides who had been captured multiple times. Well, this arrangement was stopped by General Grant. He didn't want any more exchanges. This created a major problem because now the North, the South, whoever you were, you had to now feed and clothe and house the prisoners. Well, this was undue hardship on the South because most of the war was fought in the South, and they already had a depleted supply of food and clothing, and because they couldn't even feed their own troops. But during this war, there were some 150 POW camps, forts, embankments, fields, that were housed prisoners. And among those, probably the most notorious was Andersonville. Now, Andersonville is located in southwest Georgia on 26 acres of sloping land with a stream running through the middle of it. But during February of 1864 to April of 1865, just 14 months, there was some 41,000 Union troops stuffed in there. And now, what we have left is 13,000 small white markers to remind us of that place. In 1907, a Hague Convention was held where you had several nations in the West get together and say, well, this is how we ought to treat our POWs, a little bit more humanity to them. Well, they arrived at some arrangements, but it wasn't near enough to handle what would happen during World War I. So in 1929, 43 countries got together and signed what is called the Geneva Convention. Now, this laid out certain standards for what you should feed the prisoners, how you should house them, and how the exchange would go with the wounded and the sick. Well, during World War II, the Germans that were captured by either the British or the United States were sent to the United States. The treatment could not have been really all that bad because those Germans, the prisoners, were sent to the United States in Liberty ships. Now, if you remember, the Liberty ships is what sent the troops over to Europe, and they would normally come back empty, but now they have prisoners coming back. And as many as 30,000 German prisoners a month would come back. And once they got here, they would be put in railroad cars, Pullman railroad cars, the sleepers. And they were sent to their camps. Now there were some, believe it or not, 700 POW camps in the United States. That's within 46 different states. They housed approximately 425,000 Germans, all according to the Geneva Convention. The Accords for the Convention provided for what living quarters each one would have. If you were enlisted, you got 40 square feet. If you were an officer, you got 120 square feet. Now, of this, they had 3 admirals and 40 generals as prisoners. Those were sent to a Camp Shelby in Mississippi, where each one of those had their own bungalow with garden. The Geneva Convention also required for if the prisoners had to work, they were to be paid proportionately to what the soldiers were being paid. That was 80 cents a day. They could use that money in the camp store because they were just paid in script and not in greenbacks. But also the Geneva Convention called for repatriation after the war was over. But once such German POW found out that the war was over and he was going to be repatriated back to his hometown, but his hometown was now in control of Russia. So he escapes instead of being set free and sent home. He escapes and he lives on the lam in hiding. He changes his name, changes it to Dennis Wiles. And he stayed that way living in New Mexico until 1985, when he turns himself into Bryant Gumbel on the Today Show. Right up the road, just outside of Stark, is called Camp Landing. This was one of the POW camps. Now, they have an excellent museum up there that talks about the life of the POWs, but also of the thousands and thousands of troops from all over the United States that were trained up there. Now, the Japanese POW situation was a little different. There were approximately 40,000 Japanese troops that were taken prisoner. The low number is basically because their code of battlefield conduct called for suicide rather than capture. In fact, if they surrendered and the war was over, they were subject to being imprisoned whenever they got back. So that carried over in the mindset that the Japanese, whenever they took in prisoners, is to they obviously treated Allied troops as less than human because they did not have a code like they did. Now, the news of their treatment reached other Allied bases where Japanese prisoners were kept, and so the treatment of Japanese prisoners by Allied troops was not all that up to the convention. Okay? Although most dream of escape, the odds of escape are not very good. And in World War Two, there were 90,000 Americans who were captured in Europe. 91,000 of those, only 737 escaped to rejoin their units. Now, if you were in Asia, the odds of returning were almost zero. Because once you got out of prison, that was just the beginning of the trouble. Most of those that escaped were caught within hours. The penalty for escaping, or trying to escape, was death. Nevertheless, ever since the Civil War, every soldier was urged to escape and rejoin their unit. In fact, the military code of conduct requires all soldiers to try to escape and help others in their attempt. Now, in Korea, there were about 7,000 U.S. prisoners captured by North Korean or Chinese forces. Of that, 40%, that's 2,800, died because of lack of nutrition and diet and medicine conditions. In Vietnam, most of the U.S. prisoners were officers. The reason for that is most were airmen, pilots. There were some that were taken prisoners to the villages, but most were taken to North Vietnam, one of 13 different prisons in the north. In March of 1864, Captain James Floyd Thompson was flying his observation plane called the Bird Dog. He was shot down by small arms enemy fire, and he was held prisoner for almost 9 years. He was the longest held and the earliest captive. Most U.S. prisoners were subjected to extreme torture, solitude, malnutrition. Although North Vietnam was a signatory to the Geneva Convention, little was done by the U.S. administration for fear it might spark more violent treatment. In February 12, 1973, the first of the remaining 591 U.S. prisoners were flown home. America still has many more airmen, Marines, sailors, soldiers unaccounted for. One such is Lieutenant Commander Michael Hoff, who was shot down over Laos in 1970. His wife, Mary Hoff of Orange Park, was left with 5 children, and she says, "What do I have to remember him by? What do I have to bury?" She felt there were other families in the same situation, so she contacted a company in New Jersey to make a flag. She wanted it simple. She wanted it especially for those others that had POWs. But now it's the flag that we recognize as the POW-MIA flag. It flies everywhere, even over the Capitol. In 1973, there were over 1,000 remains of Americans killed in the Vietnam War have been identified and brought to their families for proper military burial. During August alone of this year, the POW-MIA accounting agency reported that 2 remains from World War II, 2 remains from Korea, and 1 remains from Vietnam have been found and identified. So it's an ongoing effort. Now, each of us can help in this endeavor, because if you know of a family that has a POW, someone that is missing, know someone who's missing, you can take and have them contact the service they were from, or contact the POW-MIA accounting agency and give a DNA sample. That speeds along the process of identifying the remains that they find. 73 years ago, World War II ended, but yet there are over 30,000 still missing. Now, 58 years ago, the Korean War ended, but yet there's still 7,800 unaccounted for. 45 years ago, Vietnam ended, and there's still 1,600 missing. And we must remember that even when the war ends, not everyone comes home. Let us recommit to do what we can to make sure and remember the words that on the flag, the bottom of the POW flags, that you are not forgotten. I am truly humbled to be here and honored, and I thank you all very much.